Well, hello. It's good to have all of you join us. I see that we have a few so far. There'll be more who will join us later. So it's good to have you. If you get a chance, introduce yourself on the message line there. If you can't, maybe because you need to have a Google account or something. If you don't have a Google account, it may not let you do that. So I'm here outside of my house because we had some flood damage last week, and so the room that I normally do my podcast in is completely defunct. So I'll have to do this for as long as I can, and then we'll have to move someplace else in the house or whatever as I can there too. So um, I think that's all of the news that I can tell you right now. We are moving along in this book, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Um, You know, I do need to say, having read so much of Lewis, having read so many of his both his promoters and his critics, uh, there's so much that you can do in a scholarly sort of way with Lewis that number one isn't as germane to the type or nature of people that I'm trying to reach with it on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, there are other people out there who are far better thinkers and certainly scholars than what I am. But hopefully, you will find that what we're discussing here is helpful to you. Some of you know that I'm doing this. I've been doing all summer long this series on apologetics, and so as I was doing that series, I've referenced Lewis a number of times, and so there were people, I think, who were interested in this particular book, which I intend to use in that series as well. So this will give those people who attend our church a leg up in that regard. Um, on the other hand, we'll be able to explore more in depth in this way what Lewis has to say about the moral argument, or what you would call the anthropological argument for the existence of God. Just as a reminder, this particular book is a compendium of Lewis's radio addresses. I believe it was in 1943 or 1944 during the World War II uh, on the, through the BBC radio network, and um, so after he had completed that particular series, and eventually it got compiled into a book that he edited some. And this book has been one of the most influential books within Christendom in the 20th century. So one of the other things I want to say is I've read Lewis's critics. I, I think the primary argument that I've read as I've studied it is that they, in some ways, they attribute too much to what Lewis is saying, and I want to bring some clarity to that. I think so that if you if they try to say that Lewis is saying too much in terms of detail, then I think their argument stands. But I think if they really are honest and take into account what Lewis is basically saying, then it puts them very much at a disadvantage. So, what I think would be helpful is if we went just in a quick fashion, went back over what we've looked at so far, and then allow me to make some of those comments in regard to that. So, in chapter 1, Lewis is basically making the argument that, excuse me, what he calls the law of nature. And it's not the law of nature in terms of the law of nature as we understand nature, but the law of nature in his day was understood about how people should conduct themselves. What was understood that was kind of universal in terms of how people should conduct themselves. And what Lewis means by that is that everyone, everywhere, understands and believes that there is a standard of behavior that everyone else kind of knows. Now, if you get too specific on that, then of course there are certain cultures that have certain expectations that other cultures do not have. That's not Lewis's primary point. Lewis's primary point is that throughout the world and throughout history in the world, everyone has this sense of there's a right kind of behavior that you can expect from other people because they should know. Now, what that behavior is up to each society and each culture, each country, each tribe. But the idea that there is a certain standard of behavior that all people should, that there's just a standard of behavior that we should expect from people is universal. That idea of a standard behavior is universal. And so, and so, um, within every culture, every society, throughout history, in every people group, in every tribe, there's this sense of rightness and wrongness, um, of what is decent behavior, of law. There is no society, there is no culture in the world where people don't have a sense of law. Well, that's a universal. That there, and it's not just laws that we pass, but there's a certain innate law about how we should treat each other, or that there's. So again, specifics aside, there's just this sense that everyone everywhere understands that there's a standard about how we should treat each other. That standard may differ, but the fact that there is a sense of that standard of rightness and wrongness, of oughtness, is universal everywhere. And then the second thing he said in that first chapter is that out of this sense of natural law, that we don't keep it. That even though all of us believe that there is a standard of some sort, none of us is very good at keeping that law. Um, that there's this overarching sense of oughtness, and that none of us are good at keeping that sense of oughtness in that regard. So, chapter 2, Lewis shares two primary criticisms that came his way in regard to um, his position on this natural law or law of nature. And so people said, well, what you're really talking about is herd instinct. And so we just do things as a herd of people because that's what's best for us, and so we do what's best for the herd or ourselves within the herd. And Lewis says, well, no, that can't be right, because this sense of oughtness um, is it transcends that. This because there are certain things that we know we ought to do that it isn't necessarily convenient for us, and things that we ought to do that isn't necessarily what the society or culture wants, but we just know we're supposed to do it. It's just the right thing to do. And so if you want to read more about that, you can read that in chapter 2. I don't want to go too deeply into that because there are other things we need to get to tonight. The second part in chapter 2 that he talks about, so the first is herd instinct, and the second is, well, look, people said, isn't this really a social convention? Or another word for it might be customs, things that we're taught about how to behave. Um, and Lewis said, well, no, not really. Well, that's true. Those things happen, but this isn't what I'm talking about, he says. What I'm talking about is that there is a way that deep inside of all of us that we know we ought to behave, but it's not taught necessarily. And it's not relative even to us or to others. It's just this sense that we should be and should act in certain ways that um, are beneficial to others, even when it's not beneficial to us. And so he great detail about that, and that discussion really is more expansive, and so I would refer you to chapter 2 again. But the two primary critiques then were herd instinct. We do things just because we belong to a herd, so we do as the herd does, and what's maybe best for the herd as we can grasp it. And then the other criticism was that it was just social convention that we're sort of taught, and so these laws or this sense of rightness and wrongness are taught. They really don't transcend the culture or society in that way. And Lewis say no, this sense of law, this sense of rightness and wrongness transcends all that. It's there, and every nation, every tribe, every people have that sense. Where did our idea of law come from? Where did our idea of oughtness come from? At its barest roots, where did those ideas come from? And Lewis says, I think that points to a God who informs us in that way. And so that's chapter 1 and chapter 2. In chapter 3, he talks about the reality of the law itself. And so I'm going to read certain sections of this chapter, and then I'm going to make some comments in regard to those sections. And I'm sorry about that. They were haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice that you might call fair play or decency or morality or the law of nature. And then second, he says that they did not in fact do so. Now, some of you may wonder why I call this odd. It may seem to you that the most natural thing in the world. In particular, you may have thought I was rather hard on the human race. After all, you may say, what I call breaking the law of right and wrong or nature only means that people are not perfect. And why on earth should I expect them to be? That would be a good answer if what I was trying to do was to fix the exact amount of blame which is due to us for not behaving as we expect others to behave. But that is not my job at all. I am not concerned at present with blame. I'm trying to find out truth. And from that point of view, the very idea of something being imperfect, of its not being what it ought to be, has certain consequences. So he's saying that, we have this sense of oughtness, rightness, and wrongness law, that we don't practice it very well. And when we don't practice it very well, there are consequences to us for not practicing it very well. So he goes on to say, um, uh, when he makes this distinction, um, he'll say that there is a difference between being human and being a thing, and that things in life only act as they are created to act. So if a stone dislodges from a cliff and rolls down the hillside, then it's only obeying the law of gravity. And so the stone can only do what the stone can do, given its weight, its circumstances, and all of the other laws that are applied to it. But humans, he says, are different than that. And so I'll give you some examples, but that we feel that it's incumbent upon us to do more than what gravity or any other law or something might say. That there's something that transcends all that. So, and so I'll read some of his examples. If you take a thing like a stone or a tree, it is what it is, and there seems no sense in saying it ought to have been otherwise. Of course, you may say a stone is the wrong shape if you want to use it for rockery, or that a tree is a bad tree because it does not give you as much shade as you expected. But all you mean is that the stone or the tree does not happen to be convenient for some purpose of your own. You are not, except as a joke, blaming them for that. You really know that given the weather and the soil, the tree could not have been any different. What we, from our point of view, call a bad tree is obeying the laws of its nature just as much as a good one. So it's just obeying the laws that have been applied to it. Now, have you noticed what follows? It follows that what we usually call the laws of nature, the way weather works on a tree, for example, may not really be the laws in a strict sense, but only in a manner of speaking. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, it's not this much is this not much the same as saying the law only means what the stones always do. You do not really think that when a stone is let go, it suddenly remembers that it's under orders to fall to the ground. No, a stone just does what a stone does. You only mean, in fact, it does fall. In other words, you cannot be sure that there is anything over and above the facts themselves. Any law about what ought to happen is distinct from what does happen. The laws, and this is an important. So if you're following in the book, I have this highlighted heavily. The laws of nature, as applied to stones or trees, may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do. For as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and not do. So, honestly, this word ought that Lewis uses, and I can remember reading this back when I was a freshman in college, that word ought has stuck with me that entire time. That um, that that inwardly, my conscience tells me that I ought to do this, not because it's what humans do, but because there's this transcendent, this overarching thing that speaks more loudly, that speaks more accurately to who I am and what is expected of me. Now, this sense of oughtness, I think, that's resident in everyone, I think Lewis got in his reading of Scripture. My sense is that he got it from a number of different sources, biblically speaking. And so, what I want to do is to just take a few minutes to give you an outline of where we get that sense of oughtness, biblically speaking. And so, you may find this to be interesting. Um, these would be, I think, at least 7 ways in which a missionary would understand how to do missions work uh, across the world. In other words, he would leverage these things, or she would leverage these things um, to do their missionary work, so that when they go into a country that's completely different, um, different culture, different language, different laws, all that kind of stuff, there's still certain things within that those people that we share in common, even though they are utterly and completely different than us. And so here's where this oughtness comes from if you're interested in writing them down. So the first one is oughtness comes to us because we've been made in the image of God. And even though that image has been damaged by the fall, there's still enough of the image of God in us to know what we should do. It still speaks to us. Being made in the image of God means that we have an understanding of love and truth and justice and rightness, even holiness, not perfectly, anything but perfectly, but we still have that sense. And those attributes that we share, those communicable attributes that we share with God, are resident within all of humanity, and they inform them. And out of that comes a sense of oughtness, this underlying consciousness or conscience of how we should behave and what we should do, even when it doesn't seem to benefit us or even others, but it's a higher law than any social convention. So the second one would be that the law of God is written on the heart of man. And so Paul talks about that in Romans 2:15. And so we can know rightness and wrongness, and we can know oughtness because God has written his law on our hearts and our minds. And we can deny that, but every human everywhere has the law of God written on their heart and their mind and their conscience. And that sense of oughtness comes from that. The third one is through natural revelation. And so the Apostle Paul talks about in Romans 1:18-20 how even the very heathen are without excuse, for the very nature cries out of the glory of God. So nature is a form of revelation. And by being a form, and so because nature is a form of revelation, it speaks to us, it reveals um, a part of who God is and what he requires of us. And Lewis actually gets into this later on in the book when he talks about the physical laws and how those laws are hard and fast. And when you violate those laws, there are very clear consequences. And Lewis says and extrapolates that if the laws of nature are hard and fast, wouldn't it make also sense that the moral law, the law that's been written on our hearts and minds, that when we violate that, the consequences are hard and fast. And so we'll get into more of that discussion later on. And then number four, and we all know this, but there's a thing called special revelation. So people can know this sense of oughtness, rightness, and wrongness because of what we read in the Bible, in the scriptures. Now, obviously, not everybody has the Bible and scriptures, but still, there are many, many unbelievers out there who have been informed about what the Bible has to say. And so that too has informed them about what decency is, what rightness and wrongness is, what the overarching law of God is. Um, and so that informs them too. Number five is what is called the anthropological argument or the moral argument. And that is where, in the moral argument, is this idea that all of humanity has a sense of morals, a sense of rightness and wrongness about how to conduct ourselves. All of humanity has that. And just the fact that all of humanity has that points to somebody who has informed us about oughtness, rightness, and wrongness. And then number six, there's this interesting thing called the ubiquitous nature of divine appeasement. Ubiquitous means everywhere at all times, and so it's only been a relatively recent invention that civilization, and I guess now, to a certain degree, Southeast Asia in terms of China and North Korea. Um, but but only maybe since the 20th century, maybe partially beginning in the Enlightenment, humanity in terms of their history, wherever you went, no matter where you went and throughout the world, the people were religious, and in their religiosity, they had this innate sense that they had to appease some god, that they had violated some law, and that God wanted some kind of restitution for their breaking the law. And so they did a whole host of things. I mean, it all is very different and has been very different historically throughout the world. But the point is, for the bulk of human history, humankind everywhere practiced in some sort of way this sense of divine appeasement. Everyone, everywhere, in every society, tribe, and culture had this sense in which they had to appease God. We Christians believe that the fullest of that revelation came through the Judeo-Christian worldview, as it was experienced in the Old Testament and then finalized and revealed fully in the New Testament through Jesus Christ. And so the divine appeasement happened through Jesus Christ on our behalf. Prior to that, it had to be sacrifices that people made to appease God's wrath and anger for sin. And so that idea has been universal, and it's only been until recently, since the Enlightenment, mostly in the West, although China and North Korea would be the exception of that, that that divine appeasement is no longer necessary. That it was just a myth. That's what some people believe, but that's that's really an aberration in terms of what's happened over the course of human history. Um, and then number seven, this idea that God is omnipresent throughout the whole of the world, that God's omnipresence weighs itself. So this morning in church we were talking about how no one comes to the Son except that the Father draw him, and the Father is at work throughout the course of the world, working in the hearts and minds of people, drawing them to Christ uh, as it pertains to His sovereign will. And maybe number eight would be if you went to any of the almost any of the religions in throughout the world, each of those religions seem to focus on a particular attribute that makes that religion distinct. And in almost every case, not all, but in almost every case, the particular attribute that they emphasize is an attribute that would be an attribute of God's. And so, in their instinct of sensing God, as God either drew them or was informing them, or as they observed the created order or whatever it was, or sensed the law of God written on their hearts and minds, in in their experience, they came upon a particular attribute. So maybe, like for example, in Islam, it's really about the law. Judaism, it's about the law of God. Um, in in Hinduism, it's about judgment. In much of Southeast Asia, there's this overarching, experience of, when it comes to pantheism. Pan meaning all, theism God. So that God, everything is God. So there's a sense in which God is omnipresent. And so I think that there are other religions where you could extract those same kinds of ideas, but clearly, as people have, uh, wherever they invented some sort of religious faith, they seem to focus on a particular attribute or character that you could find in God. And so we as Christians worship a God, and what we understand to be His nature, the whole of His character: justice, love, holiness, kindness, loving, uh, um, uh, love, and just a whole host of those communicable attributes. We see God in a more complete fashion, but they, in their religious faith, focus on just one and then extrapolate from that. And they are able to do that because they are able to look at the created order, or a sense, feel the law of God written on their hearts and minds, or be informed about how God the Father is drawing them to the Son. Those kinds of things. So I would say there are about eight in that way. And so I think that's what Lewis is tapping into here. He's tapping into all of that and all of those biblical texts that relate to all of that, with this sense of oughtness that transcends just like customs, and everyday morality, and things like that, ethics. So picking this up again, um, he says, in other words, when you are dealing with humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts. And so I've highlighted this next section very heavily as well. You have the facts. How do men behave? And you also have something else how they ought to behave. In the rest of the universe, there need not be anything but facts. Electrons and molecules behave a certain way, and certain results follow. So we always know electrons and molecules always act in these kinds of ways. And there's no sense of oughtness. They just do. They just do because that's their nature. But humans are different than that, he says. But men have a certain way, and that is not the whole story for all the time. You know that they ought to behave differently. Now, this is really so peculiar that one is tempted to try and explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out of that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, you only mean the same as when you say that a stone is the wrong shape, namely, that what he is doing happens to be inconvenient to you. But that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first, and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient. But I blame the second man and do not blame the first. So if I want a special, if I'm taking a trolley or a subway train, and I've eyed a seat and I want to sit in that particular seat, and I walk up to it, and I'm getting ready to sit down in it, but somebody kind of beats me to it first. Well, they got there first. It's inconvenient, but I really can't blame them for that in that regard. But if I'm sitting in that seat and I get up and somebody slips in behind me, takes my suitcase or whatever, and my seat, then they've inconvenienced me too, but they've done more than that. They've done something they should not have done in that regard, is what Lewis is saying. Um, so let me see where I was here. Uh, okay. Yet the first hurt me, and the second has not. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. But though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. You cannot say that what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. As for decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it's pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. It means things like being content with 30 shillings, or at that time, 0.02 cents, when you might have gotten £3, at that time, $1.27, doing schoolwork honestly when it would be easy to cheat. So it means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have gotten £3, doing school work honestly when it would be easy to cheat, leaving a girl alone when you like to make love to her, staying in dangerous places when you would rather go somewhere safer, keeping promises you would rather not keep, and telling the truth when it makes you look like a fool. So that kind of behavior doesn't pay, but you're doing what you ought to have done. Some people say that though decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment, it still means that what pays the human race as a whole, and that consequentially there is no mystery about it. So I have this section highlighted heavily right here. Human beings, after all, have some sense. They see that you cannot have any real safety or happiness except in society where everyone plays fair. And it's because they see this that they try to behave decently. Now, of course, it is perfectly true that safety and happiness can only come from individuals, classes, and nations being honest and fair and kind to each other. It is one of the most important truths in the world. So, this next section I have highlighted very heavily. But as an explanation of why we feel as we do about right and wrong, it just misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society, then then may we ask, why should I care what's good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? So Lewis is saying here, if 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 someone says you should be unselfish because it's good for society, and you say, why should I care what is good for society? Then where does that come from? Where does this sense that it's good for society to be unselfish? What's the higher law there? Where does that come from? Why do we have that? And that's Lewis's point, primarily, in this chapter and in the second chapter. You are saying what is true, but you are not getting any further. If a man asked what the point of playing football, it would be it would not be much good saying in order to score goals. For trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game. For trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game. And you would really only be saying that football was football, which is true but not worth saying. So this page, next page here, I have highlighted pretty heavily, and I want to spend a little time on this. In the same way, if a man asks what is the point of behaving decently, it is no good replying in order to benefit society. For trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, for society after all only means other people, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you are really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have said just as much if you had stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. And that is where I do stop. Men ought to be unselfish, ought to be fair, not that men are unselfish, not that they like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. The moral law, or the law of human nature, is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is, or may be simply a fact about how heavy objects behave. On the other hand, it is not mere fancy, for we cannot rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. And it is not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience, for the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly as the same as the behavior we find inconvenient. It may even be the opposite. Consequentially, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up ourselves. So he's saying that even behind all of these laws or expectations that we have, there's something that's even bigger. There's a sense of oughtness associated with it. Um, so, as he used in the example of being unselfish because it's what's best for society, um, then where did that sense of coming what is best for society? Where's that from? Where did we get that? And so Lewis is appealing to this idea that there's this sense of oughtness that exists that calls us to a higher thing than just merely following customs or arbitrary laws or even regular laws that we have. He concludes by saying this, um, and yet it is not a fact, and yet is it not a fact that in the ordinary sense, in the same way as our actual behavior is a fact, it begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality, that in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law, which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. So that final phrase, we find pressing on us, is the law of oughtness, this idea of oughtness this sense that we have something higher that we have to appeal to heed, to obey, and that it's a um, it transcends anything that humans might invent. It's 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 written in us. It's a part of our DNA. It's a part of our code as creatures, and it makes us different than just things. It makes us unique in that way. And so, although he doesn't say this, he will say this, I believe, later on in the book, that um, in light of this sense of oughtness, that when we don't follow it, there are consequences that are involved. And those consequences not only negatively impact other people when we don't follow that sense of oughtness, but it negatively impacts us. I believe that Lewis said this, that when if we were to equate oughtness with the moral law, right? If we equate oughtness with the moral law, that that we cannot break that law. We can only break ourselves against that law. When we violate oughtness, that higher sense of rightness and wrongness that God has uh, hardwired into us, when we do that, some people will say, well, you've broken the moral law. Lewis will say later, well, sort of, but in reality, you can't break God's law. You can only break yourself against God's law. So when we don't obey the oughtness there, then there are negative consequences for all of us in that regard. Now, doing this kind of a podcast with this kind of a book really has its limitations, and I would suspect that many of you have some questions about what we talked about here, um, and so it's hard to do that because some of you can't, make comments on the comment line or whatever. So if if you have questions regarding, in particular, chapter 3, which is probably the most difficult chapter that we've read so far, in terms of understanding what Lewis is trying to say, I want you to feel free to text me or write me or call me or whatever, and we can uh, you know uh, hash it out or whatever. Maybe after so many chapters, we should all meet somewhere and kind of have a dinner or whatever, and then people can, ask questions and we can process this all together, because so much of Lewis is more accessible when he's verbally processed, when we can ask questions and get clarity through that in that way. Just remember that Lewis is building his argument here from, the law of nature or the moral law to, the the critiques about against Lewis's premise regarding the moral law, to now changing the language a little bit to this, what he calls, what he would say is this innate sense of oughtness that's in all of us, that that is more than us being human and doing what humans do. It has to do with something outside of us that is bigger than us, that um, that that causes or prompts or encourages or impels us to do things that would not be convenient, uh, that would not be easy, that may not immediately serve us or even serve the body that we belong to, but it's still the right thing to do. And Lewis is saying that oughtness comes from God, and that oughtness is universal throughout all of mankind everywhere. It's ubiquitous, It's everywhere and at all places. There is no society, there is no country where the idea of law does not exist. Whatever those laws are, law is prominent within that society, that nation, that community. There is no community where there isn't a sense among everybody, regardless of what it is, a sense of rightness and wrongness. So we may disagree on what that rightness and wrongness is, but the fact that this sense of rightness and wrongness exists points to a God, says Lewis, and then this innate sense of oughtness points to him equally as well. So I hope that's helpful to you. For those of you who can, feel free to text me and make some comments or whatever. But that's what we have for tonight. Next Sunday we will be reading chapter 4, and so I'll and thank you again. God bless.